Hello, my name is Donovan Campos, and this is the project that I have made for National History Day. It is about the Loving versus Virginia court case in 1967. Before I begin speaking about the actual court case, I will speak about the 1960s first. A lot of different things, both good and bad, had happened to America in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon to become president and also became the youngest person to have been elected for president at the time. John F. Kennedy was sadly also assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald 3 years later in 1963. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. also gave the famous I Have a Dream speech in the same year. Sidney Poitier won the Academy Award for Best Actor, becoming the first person of color to have won it in 1964. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was also sadly assassinated by James Earl Ray. In 1969, the United States sent Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to be the first people on the moon. 1960s weren't exactly the best decade for Americans. Some good things happened, like being the first country to get a man on the moon, and bad things, like our president being assassinated. Overall, it was a fine year for Americans. Sadly, it did not go well for all people in America. People of color still had it very difficult. There were Jim Crow laws and racism was still all over America. Despite slavery being abolished over 100 years ago, it was still difficult for black people to live a normal life. Jim Crow laws were laws that were made specifically for segregating black and white people. They were named after a derogatory term for black people. They were enforced from 1877 to the mid-1960s. They were first intended to separate whites and blacks in things like schools and public transportation, but then they were extended to parks, theaters, and restaurants too. They were basically intended to say that whites were above blacks. Going into the 20th century, they were only getting worse. In Georgia, blacks and whites had different parks. They couldn't play checkers together in Alabama in the 1930s due to a new law, and in 1935 they were prevented from voting with each other. Basically, these laws were all made just to black people feel like they were less, maybe sometimes even nothing compared to the white people. Around the late 1960s, things were beginning to look up for people of color. In 1954, segregation of children in public schools was actually struck down as unconstitutional with the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. The civil rights movement began in 1955 after Rosa Parks refused to give up her pussy to a white man in Alabama. In 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower had also sent federal troops to make sure 9 black students were able to get to school safely. Through the efforts of people like Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964, which outlawed discrimination. A really big thing that happened to people of color was in 1967. There was a Supreme Court case by Richard and Mildred Loving. This was a very important case because, well, it legalized interracial marriage, which let white and black people marry. It struck down any laws that banned interracial marriage. Richard Loving. Richard Loving was a white man in the Loving's case. He was born on October 29, 1933 in Central Point, Virginia, in part of the Caroline County. Unlike many other southern communities at the time, Caroline County was known for not being as segregated as other communities. There was a lot of racial mixing, meaning a lot of people from different backgrounds openly socialized and all lived well together. When he was young, he also apparently had a passion for drag car racing and winning prizes. He worked and earned a living as a construction worker. He was also of Irish and English descent. Mildred Jeter. Mildred Jeter was of European and Native American descent. She was born to Muziel Jeter and D'Oliver Jeter. She was born on July 22, 1939. She was also born in Central Point, Virginia, just like Richard. When she was young, she was very shy and a little soft-spoken. She was also so skinny that she was nicknamed String Bean, which was shortened to just Bean by her husband. It is actually a misconception that she's African American. She herself said in a 2004 interview, "I have no black ancestry. I am Indian Rappahannock." The two met when Mildred was 11 and Richard was 17. They were friends due to their family knowing each other. Since they lived in a community where they all saw themselves as a family, they often saw each other a lot at events like drag racing. In their community, it wasn't uncommon for people of different races to date each other. Mildred was attending an all-black school when she met Richard. She first thought of him as the arrogant type of person. They then began to know each other more and at one point began to date. At age 18, Mildred got pregnant, and at this point the two married each other. Mildred also already had another child from a past relationship. They were unable to marry in Virginia due to the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. The act prohibited interracial marriage and didn't let people of different races marry each other. Since it was illegal to marry people of different color back then, Richard and Mildred thought up a plan. In order to avoid the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, they went to Washington, D.C. around June in 1958 to marry. I think this was a smart idea because it helped them evade the law. They then moved back to Virginia where they tried to live their life out. It was on July 11, 1958 that they were arrested. It was around 2 a.m., just 5 weeks after the wedding. A sheriff named Garnet Brooks busted into their house in the middle of the night. He was given an anonymous tip about the two. He shone his flashlight at the two of them in bed and asked, "What are you doing in bed with this woman?" to Richard. Mildred responded, "I'm his wife." Garnet didn't stop asking questions, and at the end of it, the two were arrested for breaking Virginia's Racial Integrity Act. Richard spent a night in jail before he managed to get out on a $1,000 bond that his sister paid for. Mildred had to spend 3 nights alone in a cell for a single person until she got out by her father. They eventually pleaded guilty to what they did, and the judge gave them a choice. They could leave Virginia for 25 years or go to prison. They left and would spend around 9 years away from Virginia. The Lovings moved to Washington, D.C. and attempted to make a life for themselves there. Sadly, they never really got used to the city life. Mildred was a country girl type, so she didn't adapt to it very well. They defied what they were told to do and periodically came back to Virginia to see their family. They tried their best to not be seen together, to the point where Richard would almost never leave their house. While this was all happening to the Lovings, something else was also going on in the background. The civil rights movement was beginning to take place. The Lovings were inspired by the activism that was shown during the civil rights movement, and so Mildred decided to write to an attorney general named Robert F. Kennedy to get some help. He told her to contact the American Civil Liberties Union for help. The American Civil Liberties Union was a non-profit organization that was made to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to every person in this country by the Constitution and laws of the United States. The ACLU sent 2 lawyers to them, Bernard S. Cohen and Philip J. Hirschkopf, who both eagerly took the case. The first thing that they attempted to do was to get the case vacated, meaning that it would be overturned usually because there was an error found in it. They waited almost an entire year before they decided to take action again. They brought a class action lawsuit to the U.S. District Court of the Eastern District of Virginia, which finally got them a response from the judge who told them they had to leave for 25 years before. His name was Leon Bazile, and he stated something like, "Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference for his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix." Since it's clear that he had a lot of prejudice in his response, he might have been able to make an appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeal, but they still upheld the original ruling. The Lovings were secretly living in Virginia together by this point. Their lawyers advised them that they should only be together if they were sure that if they got arrested, they would only be held for a few hours. The ACLU also said that they would assist with the release if they have to. Eventually, their case made it to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments began on April 10, 1967. Philip, one of the lawyers, wasn't qualified to try a case in front of the court because he was 1 year shy of meeting the requirements, so anything he said had to be signed off by Bernard. Bernard had no experience beforehand of dealing in federal courts. They were both novice lawyers who accepted that they were trying one of the most important cases brought to the court. Neither of the Lovings appeared in court, but Richard did send a letter to his lawyers beforehand. It read, "Tell the court that I love my wife, and that it is just not fair that I cannot live with her in Virginia." The judges agreed, and it was a unanimous decision. On June 12, 1967, almost all laws banning interracial marriage were struck down as unconstitutional, except for in Alabama. It had taken them 9 years, but the Lovings could finally live a happy life together. They both built a house together on Richard's father's land that he gave to them. Sadly, 8 years later, they were driving home on a Saturday night when they were struck by a drunk driver in his car. Richard was killed and Mildred lost sight in her right eye. After the tragic incident, Mildred did her best to stay out of the public eye and refused most interviews. She made one rare exception in June of 2007. She was interviewed by 3 people that were working on the behalf of the gay rights group Faith in America. They asked her what her thoughts were on same-sex marriage. Despite being incredibly religious, she still made a great response. She said, "I believe all Americans, no matter their race, no matter their sex, no matter their sexual orientation, should have that same freedom to marry." Mildred also sadly died on May 2nd, 2008. She had 2 children and a lot of great-grandchildren and normal grandchildren. There was also an unofficial holiday celebrating them on June 12th, known as Loving Day, in honor of the day the Supreme Court made the unanimous decision.